Mount Vernon was the plantation home of George Washington, first President of the United States, and his wife, Martha Dandridge Custis Washington. The estate is situated on the banks of the Potomac River in Fairfax County, Virginia, near Alexandria, across from Prince George's County, Maryland. The Washington family had owned land in the area since the time of Washington's great-grandfather in 1674. In 1739 they embarked on an expansion of the estate that continued under George Washington, who came into possession of the estate in 1754, but did not become its sole owner until 1761. The mansion is built of wood in a loose Palladian style, and was constructed by George Washington in stages between 1758 and 1778. It occupies the site of an earlier, smaller house built by George Washington's father Augustine, sometime between 1726 and 1735. It remained Washington's country home for the rest of his life. Following his death in 1799, under the ownership of several successive generations of the family, the estate progressively declined as revenues were insufficient to maintain it adequately. In 1858, the house's historical importance was recognized and it was saved from ruin by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. This philanthropic organization acquired it together with part of the Washington property estate. Escaping the damage suffered by many plantation houses during the American Civil War, Mount Vernon was restored. Mount Vernon was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1960 and is today listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It is still owned and maintained in trust by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, and is open every day of the year. Allowing the public to see the estate is not an innovation, but part of a 200-year-old tradition started by George Washington himself. In 1794 he wrote, "I have no objection to any sober or orderly persons gratifying their curiosity in viewing the buildings, gardens, and California about Mount Vernon." Name. When George Washington's ancestors acquired the estate, it was known as Little Hunting Creek Plantation, after the nearby Little Hunting Creek. However, when Washington's older half-brother, Lawrence Washington, inherited, he changed its name to Mount Vernon in honor of Vice Admiral Edward Vernon, famed for the War of Jenkins' Ear and capture of the Portobello. Vernon had been Lawrence's commanding officer in the British Royal Navy. When George Washington inherited the property, he retained the name. Buildings and grounds. The current property consists of 500 acres. The main buildings, including the house, are near the riverfront. Architecture. The present house was built in phases from 1758 by an unknown architect, on the site of the Washingtons' former farmhouse. This staggered and unplanned evolution is indicated by the off-center main door, which would once have been central to an earlier facade. As completed and seen today, the house is in a loose Palladian style. The principal block, dating from 1758, is a two-storied corridor loggia flanked by two single-story secondary wings, built in 1775. These secondary wings, which house the servants' hall on the northern side and the kitchen on the southern side, are connected to the corridor loggia by symmetrical, quadrant colonnades built in 1778. The completion of the colonnades cemented the classical Palladian arrangement of the complex and formed a distinct cordon bleu, known at Mount Vernon as Mansion Circle, giving the house its imposing perspective. The corridor loggia and secondary wings have hipped roofs with dormers. In addition to its second story, the importance of the corridor loggia is further emphasized by two large chimneys piercing the roof, and by a cupola surmounting the center of the house. This octagonal focal point has a short spire topped by a gilded dove of peace. This placement of the cupola is more in the earlier Carolean style than Palladian, and was probably incorporated to improve ventilation of the enlarged attic and enhance the overall symmetry of the structure in the two wings. A similar cupola crowns the governor's house at Williamsburg. of which Washington would have been aware. Interior: the rooms at Mount Vernon have mostly been restored to their appearance at the time of George and Martha Washington's occupancy. These rooms include Washington's study, 2 dining rooms, the west parlor, the front parlor, the kitchen and some bedrooms. The interior design follows the classical concept of the exterior, but owing to the mansion's piecemeal evolution, the internal architectural features, the door cases, moldings and plasterwork, are not consistently faithful to one specific period of the 18th century revival of classical architecture. Instead, they range from severe Palladianism to a finer and later neoclassicism in the style of Robert Adam. This varying of the classical style is best exemplified in the door cases and surrounds of the principal rooms. In the west parlor and small dining rooms there are door cases complete with Ionic columns and full pediments, whereas in the hall and passageways the doors are given broken pediments supported only by an architrave. Many of the rooms are lined with painted paneling and have ceilings ornamented by plasterwork in a neoclassical style. Much of this plasterwork can be attributed to an English craftsman and emigre, John Rawlins, who arrived from London in 1771, bringing with him the interior design motifs then fashionable in the British capital. Today, visitors to Mount Vernon are shown Washington's study, a room to which in the 18th century only a privileged few were granted entree. It is a simply furnished room Washington used as a combined bathroom, dressing room and office. The room was so private that few contemporary descriptions exist. Its walls are lined with naturally grained paneling and matching bookcases. In contrast to the privacy of the study, since Washington's time, the grandest, most public and principal reception room has been the so-called New Room or large dining room, a 2-storied salon notable for its large Palladian window, occupying the whole of the mansion's northern elevation, and its fine neoclassical marble chimney-piece. The history of this chimney-piece to some degree explains the overall restrained style of the house. Too elegant and costly, I fear, for my own room. Unrepublican style of living. A determined effort has to be made to restore the rooms and maintain the atmosphere of the 18th century. This has been achieved by using original color schemes, and by displaying furniture, carpets and decorative objects which are contemporary to the house. Throughout, George Washington and his family are evident through portraits and former possessions, expressing the preservation of the mansion as a personal memorial to the Washingtons as well as a nationally important museum. Grounds. The gardens and grounds contain English boxwoods, taken from cuttings sent by Major General Henry Lee III, Light Horse Harry, which were planted in 1786 by George Washington and now crowd the entry path. The main homestead area is skirted by a carriage road with a large bowling green in the center. To each side of the green is a garden, contained by a red brick wall. These colonial revival gardens grew the household's vegetables, fruit and other perishable items for consumption. The upper garden, located to the north, is bordered by the greenhouse. Ha-ha walls are used to separate the working farm from the pleasure grounds that Washington created for his family and guests. The Botanical Garden. The museum, dedicated to the life and death of George Washington, is on the grounds and contains George Washington's survey equipment, weapons, and clothing, as well as dentures worn by the first president. Ice house, overseer's quarters, spinning room, salt house, and gardener's house are between the garden and the house. The lower garden, or southern garden, is skirted by the storehouse and clerk's quarters, smokehouse, wash house, laundry yard, and coach house. A paddock and stable are on the southern border of the garden. The old tomb is located along the river, and the new tomb, containing George and Martha Washington, is near the fruit garden with the slave burial ground just off this path. A forest trail runs along the property, and a George Washington Pioneer Farmer site, a 4-acre working farm that includes a recreation of Washington's 16-sided treading barn. History. John Washington. In 1674, John Washington and his friend Nicholas Spencer came into possession of the land from which Mount Vernon plantation would be carved, originally known by its Indian name of Epsavassan. The successful patent on the acreage was due largely to Spencer, who acted as agent for his cousin Thomas Colepepe, 2nd Baron Colepepe, the English landowner who controlled the northern neck of Virginia, in which the tract lay. Lawrence Washington. When John Washington died in 1677, his son Lawrence, George Washington's grandfather, inherited his father's stake in the property. In 1690, he agreed to formally divide the estimated 5,000-acre estate with the heirs of Nicholas Spencer, who had died the previous year. The Spencers took the larger southern half bordering Doe Creek in the September 1674 land grant from Lord Culpeper, leaving the Washingtons the portion along Little Hunting Creek of tobacco as compensation for their choice. Augustine Washington. Lawrence Washington died in 1698, bequeathing the property to his daughter Mildred. On April 16, 1726, she agreed a one-year lease on the estate to her brother Augustine Washington, George Washington's father, for a peppercorn rent. A month later the lease was superseded by Augustine's purchase of the property for £180. He almost certainly built the original house on the site sometime between then and 1735, when he and his family moved from Pope's Creek to Epsavassan, which he renamed Little Hunting Creek. The original stone foundations of what appears to have been a two-roomed house with a further 2 rooms in a half-story above are still partially visible in the present house's cellar. Lawrence Washington. Augustine Washington recalled his eldest son Lawrence home from the Appleby School, England, in 1738 and set him up on the family's Little Hunting Creek tobacco plantation, thereby allowing Augustine to move his family back to Fredericksburg at the end of 1739. In 1739, Lawrence, having reached his majority, began buying up parcels of land from the adjoining Spencer tract, starting with a plot around the grist mill on Doe Creek. In mid-1740, Lawrence received a coveted officer's commission in the regular British Army, and made preparations to go off to war in the Caribbean with the newly formed American regiment to fight in the War of Jenkins' Ear. George Washington. Lawrence died in July 1752, and his will stipulated that his widow should own a life estate in Mount Vernon, the remainder interest falling to his half-brother George. George Washington was already living at Mount Vernon and probably managing the plantation. Lawrence's widow, Anne Fairfax, remarried into the Lee family and moved out. Following the death of Anne and Lawrence's only surviving child in 1754, George, as executor of his brother's estate, arranged to lease Mount Vernon that December. Upon the death of Anne Fairfax in 1761, he inherited his sister-in-law's life estate and became sole owner of the property. In 1758, Washington began the first of 2 major additions and improvements by raising the house to 2.5 stories. The second expansion was begun during the 1770s, shortly before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. Washington had rooms added to the north and south ends, unifying the whole with the addition of the cupola and 2-story piazza overlooking the Potomac River. The final expansion increased the mansion to 21 rooms and an area of 11,028 square feet. The great majority of the work was performed by African-American slaves and artisans. Though no architect is known to have designed Mount Vernon, some attribute the design to John Arris, a prominent Virginia architect who designed Payne's Church in Fairfax County and likely Mount Terry in Richmond County. A friend of George Washington, to whom he leased his home, Arris was the great-grandson of Col. Nicholas Spencer, the original patentee of Mount Vernon with the Washingtons. Other sources credit Col. Richard Blackburn, who also designed Ripon Lodge in Prince William County and the First Falls Church. Blackburn's granddaughter Anne married Bushrod Washington, George's nephew, and is interred at the Washingtons' tomb on the grounds. Most architectural historians believe that the design of Mount Vernon is solely attributable to Washington alone and that the involvement of any other architects is based on conjecture. Agriculture and enterprise. Washington had been expanding the estate by the purchase of surrounding parcels of land since the late 1750s, and was still adding to the estate well into the 1780s. From 1759 until the Revolutionary War, Washington, who at the time aspired to become a prominent agriculturist, had 5 separate farms as part of his estate. He took a scientific approach to farming and kept extensive and meticulous records of both labor and results. In a letter dated September 20, 1765, Washington writes about receiving poor returns for his tobacco production. Can it be otherwise than a little mortifying then to find that we, who raise none but sweet-scented tobacco, and endeavor, I may venture to add, to be careful in the management of it, however we fail in the execution, and who by a close and fixed correspondence with you, contribute so largely to the dispatch of your ships in this country, showed meet with such unprofitable returns. In the same letter he asks about the prices of flax and hemp, with a view to their production. In order thereto you would do me a singular favour in advising of the general price one might expect for good hemp in your port, watered and prepared, according to Act of Parliament, with an estimate of the freight, and all other incident charges pr. On that I may form some idea of the profits resulting from the growth. I should be very glad to know at the same time how rough and undressed flax has generally, and may probably sell. For this year I have made an essay in both, and although I suffer pretty considerably by the attempt, owing principally to the severity of the drought, and my inexperience in the management, I am not altogether discouraged from a further prosecution of the scheme, provided I find the sales with you are not clogged with too much difficulty and expense. The tobacco market had declined and many planters in northern Virginia converted to mixed crops. Like them, by 1766 Washington had ceased growing tobacco at Mount Vernon and replaced the crop with wheat, corn, and other grains. Besides hemp and flax, he experimented with 60 other crops including cotton and silk. He also derived income from a new grist mill which produced cornmeal and flour for export and also ground neighbors' grain for fees. Washington similarly sold the services of the estate's looms and blacksmith. He built and operated a small fishing fleet, permitting Mount Vernon to export fish. Washington also practiced the selective breeding of sheep in an effort to produce better quality wool. The new crops were less labor-intensive than tobacco, hence, the estate had a surplus of slaves. But Washington's refused to break up families for sale. Washington began to hire skilled indentured servants from Europe to train the redundant slaves for service on and off the estate. Following his service in the war, Washington returned to Mount Vernon and in 1785 to 1786 spent a great deal of effort improving the landscaping of the estate. It is estimated that during his 2 terms as President of the United States, Washington spent a total of 434 days in residence at Mount Vernon. After his presidency, Washington tended to repairs to the buildings, socializing, and further gardening. In his will, written several months before his death in December 1799, Washington left directions for the emancipation after Martha Washington's death, of all the slaves who belonged to him. Of the 318 slaves at Mount Vernon in 1799, a little less than half, 123 individuals, belonged to George Washington and were set free under the terms of his will. When Martha Washington's first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, died without a will, she received a life interest in 1/3 of his estate, including the slaves. Neither George nor Martha Washington could free these slaves by law. Upon her death, they reverted to the Custis estate and were divided among her grandchildren. By 1799, 153 slaves at Mount Vernon were part of this dower property. In accordance with state law, George Washington stipulated in his will that elderly slaves or those who were too sick to work were to be supported throughout their lives by his estate. Children without parents, or those whose families were too poor or indifferent to see to their education, were to be bound out to masters and mistresses who would teach them reading, writing, and a useful trade, until they were ultimately freed at the age of 25. In December 1800, Martha Washington signed a deed of manumission for her deceased husband's slaves, a transaction which is recorded in the abstracts of the Fairfax County, Virginia, court records. The slaves finally received their freedom on January 1, 1801.